Welcome to Serafina Romance Audiobook Beneath the Moonlight. Secrets don't just hide, they howl. Welcome to the Werewolf Romance Shifter Audiobook, your ultimate sanctuary for raw, high-stakes werewolf romance. If you're looking for alphas who would burn the world to protect their mates and fated bonds that defy every law of the pack, you've found your home. What followed was a passion for storytelling that captures the pulse-pounding tension of the shift and the heart-stopping heat of a true claim. Because we believe every wolf has a story worth telling, we bring you fully immersive, professionally narrated tales of betrayal, redemption, and a love so feral it can't be tamed. In fact, whether you're a fan of brooding rogue kings or resilient omegas finding their power, our library is designed to keep you listening long after the sun goes down. Moments later, you'll find yourself lost in worlds where the bond is everything and the pack is family. Still, the journey is just beginning. As if pulled by a string, your next obsession is only a play button away. Deep down, you know the truth. Once you hear the call of the wild, there's no turning back. Subscribe now, join the pack, and let the moon lead the way. Chapter 1: The Architect of Order. The stone beneath my boots didn't just feel cold, it felt dead. In the heart of the Iron Ridge, mercy was a luxury for the weak, and I was many things but never weak. I stood in the damp interrogation chamber watching the traitor tremble. He was a Gamma who had tried to smuggle medicine to the rogue territories, thinking his small heart could beat louder than my laws. "Please, King Valerius," he wheezed, his blood staining the pristine gray floor. "My daughter, she was dying." I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for the howlstone hanging at my chest. It was a jagged shard of obsidian that hummed with the power of 1,000 ancestors. In that moment, I pressed my thumb against its sharp edge. A low, vibrating pulse swept through the room, turning the air into thick honey. The traitor's eyes rolled back. His mind was no longer his own because I had taken it. "Tell me who helped you," I commanded. My voice was like grinding metal, cold and final. He screamed, but his mouth moved against his will. The Southern Scouts," he choked out. What followed was a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush bone. I stepped back, adjusting my leather cuffs. To me, people were just chess pieces, and this man had moved the wrong way. I had to remove him from the board to keep the game perfect. Truth be told, I felt nothing. Feelings were like a rot that ate away at an alpha's crown, and I had cut mine out a long time ago. "Execution at dawn," I said to the guards. After that, I walked toward the heavy iron doors. I needed the fresh air of the courtyard to wash off the smell of fear. But then, I stopped. As if pulled by a string, I turned my head toward the dark corner of the hallway. Alara was there. My Luna. She was standing in the shadows, her white dress looking like a ghost against the black stone. Her eyes were wide, filled with that soft, annoying empathy she always carried around. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a tiny, sharp prick in my chest. The mating bond. It was a faint hum, a distraction I hadn't asked for. She looked at me like I was a monster, and for a second, I wondered if she was the only puzzle I'd never quite solve. Chapter 2: The Decorative Mate. The gala was a sea of gold silk and fake smiles. I walked through the ballroom with Alara on my arm, making sure every visiting alpha saw how perfect we were. She moved with grace, but her hand was like ice against mine. I could feel her heart racing through the bond, a rhythmic thumping that felt like a bird trapped in a cage. "Smile, Alara," I whispered, my lips barely moving. "They need to see that their queen is happy." "Happy?" she breathed back, her voice trembling. "You just sentenced a father to death, Valerius. How can I smile?" Deep down, she knew the truth, but she still asked. I gripped her waist a little tighter, pulling her flush against my side. In fact, I liked the way she felt, even if I hated the way she thought. She was my crown, the jewel that made my brutal rule look legitimate. Still, the bond was acting up tonight. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was a nagging itch under my skin. Power requires sacrifice, I told her, my eyes scanning the room for threats. You are here to look beautiful and keep the peace. Leave the blood to me. Soon after, a servant brought us wine. The scent of her, jasmine and rain, started to cloud my focus. It was infuriating. I was a king meant for war, not for the soft pull of a woman's soul. That's why I made sure to ignore the way her thumb brushed against my palm. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't reach the man behind the stone. Eventually, my lead general approached us. He leaned in close, his face tight with worry. "The alphas are talking, sire," he muttered. "They say you've grown soft. They say Luna's mercy is rubbing off on you," which meant my authority was at risk. I looked at Alara, her face pale under the chandeliers. As the silence stretched, I realized the bond was a liability. It was a chain that pulled me toward her when I needed to stand alone. If I wanted to be the greatest king in history, I had to prove that I didn't need a heart. Chapter 3. The Decision of the King. The Obsidian Plaza was empty under the midnight sky. I stood at the center of the arena, looking up at the jagged moon. Beneath the moonlight, the air felt sharp enough to cut. I had spent my whole life building this kingdom, and I wouldn't let it fall apart because of a fated connection. Before she could move, a memory flashed in my mind. The day the bond snapped into place. It felt like fire blooming beneath my skin. I remembered the joy in Alara's eyes when she realized we were fated. But then, I remembered my father. He had loved his mate so much that he let the pack starve rather than risk her in battle. I wouldn't be that man. "I will not be weak," I growled into the wind. As if fate demanded it, the howlstone glowed a deep, angry red. It answered my dark thoughts. To unite the world, I needed to be a god, and gods didn't have mates. Because of that, I began to plan the trial of strength. It would be a public display of my power. I would show the packs that I could break even the gods' own laws. Truth be told, a part of me felt a sick sense of dread. Between them, something cracked, even before the trial began. I could feel Alara sleeping in our bedchambers through the bond. She felt warm. She felt like home. Yet, I pushed the feeling away. I had to be the architect of order, and that meant destroying the one thing that made me human. What followed was a cold, calculated resolve. I would punish her to prove my strength. I would reject her to prove my independence. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just my own ambition, but the decision was made. I felt a single cold tear prick my eye, but I wiped it away before it could fall. "Prepare the plaza," I whispered to the shadows. "The people need to see what happens to a king's heart." Just like that, the path was set. The bond pulsed one last time, a warning that I ignored. I walked away from the arena, my shadow stretching long and dark behind me. In that moment, I wasn't just a king. I was a monster in the making. Chapter 4. The Severing. The sun hadn't even fully risen, yet the Obsidian Plaza was already packed with thousands of silent wolves. Beneath the moonlight of the fading dawn, the air tasted like copper and old snow. I stood on the high dais, my fingers white-knuckled as I gripped the hilt of my ceremonial blade. At that moment, I felt Alara before I saw her. The mating bond was screaming, a frantic, pulsing rhythm of terror that made my own blood feel like it was boiling. What followed was the sound of heavy chains rattling against the stone. The guards led her into the center of the circle. She wasn't wearing her silk gala dress anymore. They had dressed her in a thin, white shift that fluttered in the cold wind. Her eyes found mine, searching for the man who had whispered promises in her ear just a week ago. But then, she saw the howlstone glowing dark purple against my chest. She saw the king, not the mate. "Valerius, please," she whispered. Her voice was thin, but in the silence of the plaza, it carried like a thunderclap. Because the eyes of every alpha in the territory were on me, I couldn't flinch. I had to be the architect of order. I stepped down from the dais, each footfall echoing like a hammer on a coffin. As the silence stretched, I raised the howlstone high. The obsidian shard drank the morning light, pulsing with a hungry, predatory energy. "The bond makes us slaves," I roared to the crowd. "It makes us soft. Today, I prove that a king is master of his own soul." Without warning, I lunged. I didn't strike her with the blade. I struck her with the power of the stone. A wave of raw, psychic force slammed into her, designed to shatter the metaphysical tether between our souls. Alara collapsed, a guttural scream ripping from her throat that tore through my heart like a jagged claw. Between them, something cracked. I felt the bond fray, then snap with the force of a whip. And just like that, everything changed. The constant hum in my head died. The warmth in my chest turned into an arctic void. I stood over her broken, shivering form, feeling the absolute, terrifying silence of a man who had truly become alone. I had won. Truth be told, it felt like dying. Chapter 5. The Ghost Pains. 3 weeks had passed since I watched the guards dump Alara's lifeless body at the edge of the neutral zones. Come morning, I expected to feel the triumph of a conqueror. Instead, I felt like a house with the windows blown out. I sat in my war room staring at maps of the Northern Reach, but the ink looked like blurred shadows. "Sire, the western borders are secured," General Crix reported. No matter how hard she tried to stay out of my head, Alara was everywhere. I could still smell the jasmine and rain in the curtains. In fact, the silence was worse than the nagging bond ever was. It was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that made sleep impossible. Moments later, I dismissed the general with a sharp wave of my hand, needing to be alone with the rot in my soul. That night, I walked into our old bedchamber. The room was cold. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the silk pillow where her head used to rest. As if pulled by a string, my wolf stirred deep inside me, a wounded, feral thing that wanted to howl until the walls crumbled. Because I couldn't handle the memory, I grabbed the sheets and ripped them from the bed. "She is gone," I snarled at the empty room. "She was a weakness. I am the king." As the silence roared back at me, I realized I was lying. I hadn't killed the bond. I had only wounded it. It was still there, a ghost pain, a phantom limb that throbbed with every heartbeat. I took a torch from the wall and tossed it onto the pile of silk. Soon after, the room was filled with orange light and the smell of burning memories. I watched the fire, hoping it would cauterize the hole in my chest, but the void only grew deeper. Chapter 6. The New War. The smoke from the bedchamber hadn't even cleared before I was back on the throne, draped in heavy furs. By the time the sun hit the high windows, my court was filled with nervous nobles. They saw the dark circles under my eyes. They saw the way I gripped the howlstone until my knuckles bled. Still, they didn't dare speak. "We are expanding," I announced, my voice cracking like a whip. "The neutral zones are no longer neutral. Every rogue, every stray, every masterless wolf will be branded or broken." What followed was a murmur of shock. My advisors looked at each other, terrified. Even so, no one moved to stop me. I moved my entire court to a military footing, turning the palace into a fortress of steel and fear. Because I couldn't stop the pain inside, I decided to inflict it on the world outside. If I had to live in a desert, I would make sure everyone else was thirsty too. "If I sacrificed my mate for this empire," I growled, standing up so fast my chair toppled, "it had better be an empire of ash." As the truth unraveled, I realized I was hunting for something I could never find. I was looking for a war big enough to drown out the memory of Alara's scream. At that moment, a messenger burst through the heavy doors, sweating and pale. He fell to his knees, clutching a scroll sealed with the mark of the Southern Scouts. "Sire, news from the neutral zone," he panted. Before the words left his lips, my heart skipped. For a split second, the ghost of the bond flared, a tiny, sharp spark of life. But then, I crushed it. I snatched the scroll and ripped it open, my eyes scanning the report. The scouts had found the clearing where they left her. The ground was stained with blood, but the body was gone. There were no tracks, no scent. Just a single white flower crushed into the mud. As the sky darkened outside, I felt a new kind of fire bloom beneath my skin. It wasn't love. It was a cold, predatory hunger. She was out there. Somewhere in the dark, my broken mate was breathing, and she let it happen. The transformation of my grief into an obsession that would burn the world down just to find her. Chapter 7. The Shadow Army. The mountains of the Shatterlands looked like the teeth of a dying god, jagged, white, and cold. Beneath the moonlight, I stood on the balcony of my forward command post, staring into the swirling fog. 2 years had passed since the plaza, and the silence in my head had grown into a permanent, icy cavern. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about conquest. I was thinking about the reports of the invisible raids that were bleeding my northern outposts dry. What followed was a low growl from my lead scout. "They strike and vanish, sire. No scent, no tracks. It's as if the fog itself is hunting us." Because I refused to believe in ghosts, I tightened my grip on the stone railing until the granite groaned. In fact, these rebels, these moonless, were moving with a military precision that mocked my own elite guard. They didn't fight like desperate rogues. They fought like a hive mind, a single organism of disciplined rage. Moments later, a cold wind whipped my hair across my face, carrying the scent of ozone and wet earth. Still, I felt a strange tremor in my soul. As if pulled by a string, I looked toward the deepest part of the canyon. Deep down, I knew the truth. Something was different about this enemy. They weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for a reckoning. That night, I stayed awake until the candles gutted out, staring at the empty maps, wondering how a shadow could hold a blade. Chapter 8. The Hound and the Ghost. Come morning, the reality of the threat arrived in a blood-stained crate. Inside were the rank tabs of my best trackers, each one snapped in half. As the silence roared in the command tent, I looked at the lone survivor, a man whose eyes were glazed with a terror I had never seen in a ridgewolf. "It was a ghost, sire," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Kalen, the one who disappeared years ago. He was leading them, but he wasn't the master." Without warning, I felt a jolt of electricity shoot down my spine. Kalen was a legend, a man who had lost everything. Yet the tracker wasn't done speaking. As the truth unraveled, he described the leader, a figure in charcoal armor who moved with a terrifying quiet stillness. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the Howlstone reacting to a threat, but the shard at my chest began to pulse with a sickly, frantic heat. She looked at me," the survivor choked out. "She didn't growl, she just watched. And I felt my own mind. Open. Because I couldn't tolerate the idea of a power greater than my own, I lunged forward and grabbed the man by his collar. In that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. A tiny, sharp needle of heat in the void of the bond. Truth be told, I wanted to kill him for the hope his words gave me. I threw him aside and turned to the weapons rack, my blood singing a dark, violent song. Chapter 9. The First Encounter. Soon after, I led a strike team into the heart of the Shatterlands. We moved through a narrow pass where the air was thin and tasted of iron. Between one breath and the next, the world went silent. My wolves stopped in their tracks, their ears pinned back. Without thinking, I reached for my sword, my heart skipping as the fog began to thicken into a wall of gray wool. Before the words left my lips, a hooded figure appeared on a ledge 100 feet above us. As the wind shifted, the scent hit me. Jasmine and rain, sharpened by the smell of cold steel. The moment our eyes locked, the world tilted. The bond didn't just hum, it screamed. It was a roar of agony and power that brought me to my knees in the snow. "Alara?" I gasped, the name hanging in the air like a curse. As her wolf stirred, or whatever it had become, she didn't answer. She simply raised a hand, and just like that, a dozen moonless warriors materialized from the mist. They moved like shadows dancing between the rocks. With every heartbeat, I felt her resonance, a collective, focused pressure that felt like being crushed by the weight of the mountain itself. Before I could move, she turned and vanished into the fog, leaving me gasping for air in the sudden, terrifying quiet. Chapter 10. The Burning Fever. The maps on the table were useless because the enemy I was fighting didn't exist in the physical world. Beneath the moonlight of the third night since the encounter, I sat hunched over the howlstone, my breath coming in ragged hitches. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Not the fragile girl in the white shift, but the charcoal-armored wraith with eyes of molten silver. In that moment, the bond wasn't just a memory. It was a living, breathing parasite that was eating me from the inside out. What followed was a desperate attempt to use the stone to track her. I poured my willpower into the obsidian shard, demanding it find the source of the jasmine and rain scent. Instead, the stone buckled. It didn't show me her location. It showed me her agony. I felt the phantom sting of the whip I had used in the plaza. I felt the cold mud of the neutral zone. As the silence roared in my ears, I realized the bond was reflecting my own cruelty back at me. Because the pain was too much to bear, I roared and swept the maps off the table. Moments later, General Crix entered the tent, his face a mask of poorly hidden fear. He didn't look at me. He looked at the way my hands were shaking. In fact, the soldiers outside were whispering that the king had been cursed by the ghost of the Shatterlands. Still, I stood tall, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Ready the vanguard," I commanded, though my chest felt like it was filled with hot coals. We march on the high ridges at dawn. Chapter 11. The Midpoint Shift. The ambush didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a whisper. We were halfway up the spine of the world when the fog turned into a solid wall. Without warning, the air thickened with the scent of ozone. Before either could speak, the first line of my guards simply collapsed. They weren't wounded. They were clutching their heads, screaming as if their brains were being turned inside out. As her wolf stirred, Alara stepped out of the gray void, her charcoal blade drawn and gleaming. The moment their eyes locked, the world didn't just tilt, it shattered. I expected her to lung at me with rage. I expected a plea for my life. Instead, she looked at me with a cold, terrifying pity. Between them, something cracked, but it wasn't the bond. It was my understanding of power. I lunged at her, my sword swinging in a lethal arc, but she moved like smoke. As her name left his lips, she caught my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for an Omega. "You think you broke the bond, Valerius?" she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind like a choir of the dead. "You didn't break it, you sharpened it." And just like that, everything changed. The bond flared into a resonance. I didn't just feel her, I became her. I felt the weight of every moonless soldier's hope. I felt the collective rage of the outcasts I had created. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that she was winning or the look of utter terror in my eyes. She didn't kill me. She simply leaned in, her scent burning my lungs, and whispered, "I am the consequence of your order." Chapter 12. Escalation. What's worse than losing a battle is losing your mind. I retreated to the Iron Ridge Fortress, but the fortress felt like a cage. By the time I reached the throne room, I was shouting orders that made no sense. Because the resonance was still ringing in my bones, I could hear the thoughts of my guards, their doubt, their growing mutiny, their secret wish for the Moonless Queen to arrive. Truth be told, I was losing my kingdom because I had already lost the war within myself. "Bring me the forbidden scrolls," I screamed at the court scholars. "I will activate the Soul Crush ritual. I will silence her forever." What followed was a wave of gasps. The Soul Crush was a myth, a ritual that would kill the caster along with the target. Even so, I didn't care. I was a man drowning in a sea of jasmine-scented fire, and I would burn the entire ocean to stop the burning. As the sky darkened with a storm that felt like Alara's approaching breath, I realized my generals were backing away from the throne. They didn't see a king anymore. They saw a madman. Moments later, I stood alone in the dark, the Howlstone pulsing a violent, jagged red. As though fate whispered a warning, I felt the bond pulse one last time, a soft, mournful tug. It was Alara, mourning the man I used to be before I became a tyrant. And she let it happen. The final descent. I took the ceremonial dagger and began to carve the ancient runes into the obsidian floor. I wasn't just fighting a war against the moonless. I was preparing to commit the ultimate sin. Chapter 13. The King's Gambit. The obsidian floor of the Obsidian Plaza didn't just reflect the moonlight, it seemed to drink it. Beneath the moonlight, the runes I had carved bled a faint, ethereal blue, humming with a frequency that made my teeth ache. At that moment, I stood at the center of the trap, my fingers tracing the hilt of my blade. I had Kaelin, the ghost of the Shatterlands, chained to a pillar of iron behind me. He was the lure, the one piece of bait I knew her tactical empathy couldn't ignore. What followed was a silence so thick it felt like drowning. I could feel her approaching. It wasn't a scent yet, nor a sound. It was a pressure in the back of my skull, a tidal wave of sorrow and resolve that belonged to the moonless. Because I was a man who had traded his soul for a crown, I welcomed the pain. I wanted her here. I wanted to see the look in her eyes when she realized that even a queen could be caged by a king who had nothing left to lose. Still, my wolf was pacing behind the bars of my ribs, whining in a way that disgusted me. As if pulled by a string, the Howlstone began to glow, its red light clashing with the blue of the ritual circle. Deep down, she knew the truth, that I was a monster, but she was coming anyway. Moments later, the heavy iron gates at the far end of the plaza began to groan, moving outward as if pushed by a collective invisible force. I stood my ground, my heart a cold stone in my chest, waiting for the only woman who could truly destroy me. Chapter 14. The Capture. Without warning, the gates didn't just open, they were torn from their hinges. Alara stepped into the plaza, her charcoal armor reflecting the crimson light of the stone. Behind her, the shadows seemed to move, 1,000 moonless eyes watching from the darkness of the colonnades. Before either could speak, I stepped toward Kaelin, placing the tip of my dagger against his throat. In that moment, I felt her flinch through the bond. The connection was so sharp now that I could feel the individual beads of sweat on her forehead. One step closer, Alara, and the ghost becomes a memory, I growled, my voice echoing in the hollow space. As the silence stretched, she stopped. She didn't growl. She didn't reach for her sword. Instead, she lowered her hood, revealing the silver-white hair that had become the banner of the rebellion. Between them, something cracked, a final shard of the man I used to be. In fact, I wanted her to scream. I wanted her to hate me. Yet, she just looked at me with that same haunting pity she had shown on the mountain. As the bond pulsed, I realized she wasn't trapped. She had walked in here because she knew I couldn't pull the trigger. "You've already killed everything that matters, Valerius," she said, her voice a soft ripple in the frozen air. "What is one more ghost to a man who lives in a graveyard?" Because her words cut deeper than any blade, I pressed the knife harder into Kaelin's skin. And just like that, everything changed. My guards moved from the shadows, surrounding her with silver-tipped spears. I had her. She was pinned, her army forced to watch from the periphery as their queen was brought to her knees. Truth be told, I felt no triumph. I only felt a hollow, rotting cold that began at the base of my spine and moved upward toward my heart. Chapter 15. The Omega's World. What's worse than a prisoner who fights is a prisoner who submits with a smile. I walked toward her, my boots clicking rhythmically on the etched stone. By the time I stood over her, the ritual runes were glowing so bright they burned the edges of my vision. I reached down, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at me. As her name left his lips, I expected to see fear. I expected to see the Omega I had discarded 2 years ago. See? You are still just an Omega in a king's world, I sneered, though the words tasted like ash. Instead, her eyes flared with a sudden, blinding silver light. As her wolf stirred, I felt a surge of power through the bond that nearly knocked me off my feet. It wasn't an attack, it was an invitation. She let me see the Shatterlands. She let me see the families I had broken, the children who slept in the dirt because of my order. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was the stone finally breaking my mind, but I saw myself through her eyes, a small, frightened boy wearing a crown that was too heavy for him. Moments later, I pulled my hand away as if I had been burned. Before she could move, she whispered, "The world isn't made of kings and omegas anymore, Valerius. It's made of the broken who have learned to heal." As the sky darkened with the coming storm of the climax, I realized the trap hadn't caught her. It had caught me. I turned to my guards, my voice shaking as I gave the order to take her to the highest tower. And she let it happen, walking toward her cell with the dignity of a woman who had already won the war before the first blow was even struck. Chapter 16. The Hollow Victory. The victory feast felt more like a funeral. Beneath the moonlight streaming through the high-arched windows of the Iron Ridge, I sat at the head of the table, staring at a goblet of wine I hadn't touched. Ilara was in the highest tower, locked behind silver bars, yet it was I who felt like the prisoner. In that moment, the silence of the fortress was deafening. My generals were whispering, their eyes darting to the empty seat beside me where Luna should have sat. What followed was a report that made the wine turn to vinegar in my throat. Despite their queen being captured, the Moonless were not retreating. In fact, they were striking with a new, frantic desperation, burning my supply depots and turning my own border guards against me. Because I had taken their heart, they were now a body moving on pure, mindless instinct. Moments later, a cold shiver raced down my spine as the howlstone began to throb with a dull, sickening heat. Still, I tried to maintain the mask of the tyrant. I gripped the arms of my throne, my knuckles white and bloodless. Deep down, she knew the truth, and now I was starting to know it too. I was losing my grip on the kingdom even as I tightened my fist. That night, I dismissed the court early, unable to stomach the sight of their forced loyalty. I walked the hollow halls alone, the echo of my own footsteps sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to my own destruction. Chapter 17. The Betrayal of Self. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my private chambers, and for the first time in years, I really looked at the man staring back. As if pulled by a string, my hand moved to the howlstone. My skin was pale, my eyes sunken, and there was a tremor in my fingers that no amount of willpower could stop. Without warning, the stone flared, showing me a reflection that wasn't mine. I saw a monster made of obsidian and shadow, a creature that had traded its mate for a handful of cold dust. What's worse was the realization that I had become the very weakness I tried to purge. I wasn't strong, I was just empty. As her name left his lips, a single sob threatened to break through my throat, but I choked it back. Because the soul crush ritual was already drawing from my life force, I felt a sudden sharp pain in my lungs. I was dying. The crown was acting as a parasite, and the kingdom was the host I was killing. Truth be told, I wanted to run to the tower. I wanted to fall at her feet and beg for the bond to be restored. Yet, the pride of a king is a stubborn poison. At that moment, I saw the first flare of fire on the horizon. The capital was burning. My own men were deserting their posts, leaving their spears in the mud as they fled the coming storm. Before she could move, or rather, before I could, I realized that the broken wolves I had discarded were now the only ones with the strength to stand. Chapter 18. The Dark Night of the King. The bells of the Iron Ridge began to toll, a slow, rhythmic mourning that shook the very foundations of the castle. As the sky darkened with the smoke of 1,000 fires, I walked toward the obsidian plaza one last time. It was empty. The guards had fled. Between them, something cracked, and the ritual runes I had carved began to glow with a dying, flickering light. As her wolf stirred within the bond, I felt Alara's presence reaching out, not with a blade, but with a final crushing weight of reality. And just like that, everything changed. I realized she wasn't coming to save me. She wasn't even coming to kill me. She was coming to replace me. By the time the first gate fell, I was sitting on the cold stone floor of the plaza, my crown lying in the dust at my feet. As the silence roared in my head, I felt the bond transition from a hum to a roar of 1,000 voices, 1,000 moonless, 1,000 souls I had tried to silence. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the end of a long, bad dream. Soon after, the doors to the plaza burst open. Without thinking, I didn't reach for my sword. I didn't reach for the stone, I just closed my eyes and waited for the light to take me. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of jasmine one last time, I felt the cold weight of my legacy finally break me. I was a king of nothing, standing in a kingdom of ash, waiting for the woman I had broken to show me how to die. Chapter 19. The Psychic Infection. The heavy doors didn't just open. They disintegrated under a wave of silver pressure. Beneath the moonlight pouring through the shattered ceiling, Alara walked toward me, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood the collective psyche of the moonless, a sea of glowing eyes and bared teeth. At that moment, I tried to stand, my fingers scrabbling for the howlstone, but my limbs felt like lead. I expected her to drive a blade through my throat. Instead, she simply opened her mind. What followed was an infection of the soul. As if pulled by a string, the mating bond, the very thing I had tried to cauterize, became a conduit for every ounce of pain I had inflicted. I felt the hunger of the outcasts. I felt the cold of the Shatterlands. I felt the sting of every rejection and the weight of every chain. Because the resonance was absolute, I couldn't look away. Moments later, I was vomiting bile onto the obsidian floor, my mind buckling under the sensory data of 1,000 lives I had deemed worthless. Still, she kept walking, her charcoal armor humming with a terrifying rhythmic light. Deep down, she knew the truth, that my order was just a mask for my own fear. In fact, I was no longer the king of the ridge. I was a drowning man in an ocean of my own making. As the silence roared, I saw Kaelin and the other scouts systematically dismantling my remaining elite guards in the halls beyond. My empire wasn't being conquered, it was being erased. Chapter 20. The final stand, without warning. The howlstone at my chest shattered. The obsidian shards sliced into my skin, but I didn't feel the bite of the glass. As the truth unraveled, I realized the ritual I had started, the soul crush, was turning on its master. The room began to spin, the blue runes on the floor glowing with a lethal, blinding intensity. Before either could speak, I reached for the dagger at my belt, my hand shaking so violently the steel rattled against my leather greaves. "Kill me!" I choked out, the words sounding like dry leaves. "End it, Alara. Finish your vengeance." As her name left his lips, she stopped just inches from me. She didn't draw her sword. Between them, something cracked, but it was the last of my resolve. Yet she didn't look at me with hate. She looked at me like a gardener looks at a weed that has finally been pulled. Because I had tried to kill the heart of the kingdom, I was now witnessing its rebirth. Moments later, I felt the life force being sucked out of me by the very stone I had worshipped. I wanted to die as a king, but I was dying as a warning. Truth be told, I was terrified. I saw the shadow of the great wolf rising behind her, its silver fur gleaming with the light of the true moon. As if fate demanded it, I realized I had never been the alpha. I had just been a placeholder for a power I couldn't understand. Before she could move, I slumped against the base of my throne, the weight of the crown finally snapping my spirit. I was a ghost, before I was even a corpse. Chapter 21. The Hand of the Moonless. And just like that, everything changed. Alara knelt before me, her hand reaching out to touch my forehead. As the wind shifted, the scent of jasmine and rain filled my lungs one last time, but this time it wasn't a distraction. It was a mercy. By the time her fingers brushed my skin, the soul crush ritual hit its peak. The air thickened with the smell of ozone and burning spirit. As her wolf stirred, she took the agony I was feeling, and she shared it. "I am not your vengeance, Valerius," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the middle of my mental storm. "I am the balance." What's worse was that I finally understood her. No matter how hard she tried to save me, the ritual I had sparked was a one-way door. I was the sacrifice required to break the cycle of tyranny. As the sky darkened to a deep, bruised purple, I felt my heart skip its final beat. In the span of a breath, the bond went from a roar to a gentle, fading hum. I looked up at her, seeing not the mate I had rejected, but the queen the world deserved. Soon after, the darkness began to close in at the edges of my vision. As the bond pulsed one last time, I gave her the only thing I had left, a single silent nod of recognition. I didn't want to rule anymore. I didn't want the stone or the throne. Just like that, the space between us burned with a final, blinding light. I felt the weight of the iron ridge lift off my shoulders, and as I drifted into the void, the last thing I heard was the sound of 1,000 wolves howling. Not in fear, but in freedom. Chapter 22. The climax. The world didn't end with a scream. It ended with the sound of glass breaking in a vacuum. Beneath the moonlight that now flooded the ruins of the obsidian plaza, the Howlstone's final shards disintegrated into gray ash. In that moment, I felt my physical body begin to fail, the ritual's feedback loop tearing through my remaining nerves like liquid fire. Alara stood over me, her silver eyes reflecting a version of me I barely recognized. A man stripped of his armor, his ego, and his crown. What followed was the final confrontation of our souls. I tried to speak, to offer one last defense of my life, but the words died in my throat. Because the bond was now a bridge of pure truth, there was no room for lies. I saw her hand descend, but she wasn't reaching for her charcoal blade. Instead, she grasped the air itself, pulling the scattered energy of the soul crush into her own palm. Moments later, the blue fire that was supposed to kill me was absorbed into her, her skin glowing with the ancient radiance of the moonborn. Still, I felt the pull of the void. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, the cold stone biting into my skin. Deep down, she knew the truth, that the only way for the ridge to live was for the king to die. As the silence roared, I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the hem of her cloak. Just like that, everything changed. The agony stopped. The fire vanished. In its place was a quiet, hollow peace that felt more like a blessing than a punishment. Chapter 23. Falling Action. The King's Relief. By the time the smoke cleared, the plaza was silent. The fighting in the halls had stopped, replaced by the hushed breathing of 1,000 wolves who had witnessed the end of an era. As the wind shifted, I looked up at Alara. She wasn't looking at me with triumph. She was looking at me with a profound, weary sadness. Without warning, I felt the tether finally snap, not with the violent whip crack of the plaza years ago, but with the gentle release of a leaf falling from a tree. "It's done, Valerius," she whispered, her voice a soft echo in the hollow of my mind. What's worse was that I didn't want to fight it. In fact, I felt a sudden, sharp relief. The weight of the iron ridge, the crushing pressure of the architect of order, it all just evaporated. As her name left his lips for the very last time, I felt the life force in my chest flicker like a dying candle. Because I had surrendered my soul to the balance she represented, the darkness didn't feel like a monster anymore. It felt like sleep. Truth be told, I was grateful. As if fate demanded it, I watched her turn away from me to face her people. She didn't need to strike the final blow. The ritual I had started had already claimed my life. Moments later, I felt my vision start to blur, the silver light of her presence becoming the only thing I could see. And she let it happen, the peaceful transition from a tyrant to a memory. I closed my eyes, the scent of jasmine and rain lingering on my last breath, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. Chapter 24. The Moonless Dawn. The world continued, even as the man who tried to control it faded into the ether. Come morning, the sun didn't rise on the Iron Ridge. It rose on the Shatterlands United. As the truth unraveled, I watched from the edge of the great beyond as my obsidian throne was dragged into the center of the plaza. What followed was a transformation more powerful than any wolf's shift. The Moonless didn't burn the palace. They opened the doors. No matter how hard she tried to stay a simple rogue, Alara was now the heartbeat of a new world. In that moment, I saw Kaelin standing by her side, not as a general, but as a brother. Because the Howlstone was gone, the wolves no longer moved through fear, but through the resonance Alara had taught them. Soon after, I saw my own crown being melted down, the gold and iron reshaped into small, simple tokens of belonging for the outcasts I had once hunted. As the bond pulsed in a final cosmic echo, I realized my legacy wasn't the empire I built, but the queen I accidentally created. In the stillness that followed, the statue in the plaza was replaced not with another king, but with a garden where the jasmine grew wild and free. As if the forest watched, the wolves of the ridge and the Shatterlands began to howl together, a harmony that bridged the gap between the broken and the whole. And she let it happen, the healing of a world that no longer needed a king, leaving me to finally find the silence I had sought for so long.